Hello and welcome to another episode of Stolaroid Stories. This is the podcast where we talk about topics related to writing in a second language, writing in English, learning in general, and education and self-development. My name is Fabio. I'm Italian. English is my second language. I'm also an English as a foreign language teacher and writer. And in today's episode, I had the privilege to talk with Barbara Serra. Now, if you don't know who she is, Barbara is an award-winning journalist. She was born in Italy, but she spent most of her life in the UK. Over 20 years ago, she became the first non-native English speaker to ever present a primetime news program on British TV. She has worked for some of the biggest international news networks like Al Jazeera, Sky News, and the BBC. She's a highly respected journalist in Italy. I've seen her many times on TV. She's written for national newspapers, Italian newspapers. Barbara has a newsletter called News with a Foreign Accent, where she talks about what it means to be a journalist if English is your second language. But it's not just for journalists. I think it's something that you can check out if you're interested in developing confidence, especially if you're developing confidence in speaking and expressing yourself in English if English is not your first language, especially if you are a public speaker, I would say. Last but not least, Barbara was awarded a knighthood by the Italian government for her career in journalism. In this episode, we talked about accent, the relationship between accent and identity and culture. We talked about her career as a journalist. We talked about pronunciation, international news, what international news really is, and we talked about Barbara's course for non-native English speakers. Well, it was a real privilege for me to have her here on my show as a guest. I hope that you will enjoy this conversation. Get ready now. It's story time. Hello, Barbara, and welcome to Stolaroid Stories. It's a real privilege to have you here today on my show as one of my guests. Thank you for accepting my invitation and welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Barbara, you are over 20 years ago, you became the first ever non-native English speaker to present a primetime news program on British TV. And I'm sure that many of my listeners would want to know how you managed to achieve such an ambitious goal. So my first question is this: how did you do that?
So again, thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. It's a topic that I talk about quite a lot, and it's such a top line, first non-native English speaker to present a news program. For a long time, I was the only, which isn't a good thing because it meant that as an experiment 20 years ago, it didn't work. Now, I think we need to specify, just to be clear, it was at Channel 5. It was around 2005, 2006 for about 6 months. And I am obviously a sort of journalist, and around that time is when I'd started news presenting. I think, there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes on into the phrase non-native speaker. So what do we mean by non-native speaker, right? So obviously someone who doesn't have English as a first language, but especially in a city like London, where a lot of people would have, different heritages, often different languages in their own families, you could maybe have a native language of, whatever your own mother's language was, but then the second you went to nursery, you started learning English. So as far as I read it, that to me technically is a non-native speaker, but really I think if you learn a language ages 2, 3, 4, your brain is so absorbs so much that you are effectively speaking that language like a native speaker. So that was not my case. I learned English when I was about 8 or 9. actually between 9 and 10, to be honest. I am an Italian native speaker. My family moved to Denmark when I was 9, went to an international school, and so learned English within an international environment in Denmark, which isn't a native English speaking country. So look, I'm kind of going round the houses here, but just to explain that when we say second language, non-native speaker, people have different ways of being non-native speakers. I will always appreciate that one of my privileges was that I learned English while I was still not a young child, but just in the pre-teen years. And I'm not a linguist, but a lot of, the linguistics teachers I have spoken to say that, our pronunciation, our language kind of fixes around 14, 15. So anything that you learn before that, you would probably learn and manage to speak in a sort of more natural accent. Whereas after the ages of sort of 14, 15, we kind of get stuck. Well, stuck is a bad word, but we're fixed in whatever language we have been speaking to that point. So I'm a funny case because I am not a native speaker, but I did start learning English while I was still just within that window of change, which is why most people will say, or most native speakers will say, that I sound odd, that there's obviously something weird in my voice. And obviously I've done an awful lot of work on my voice and my presentation. I have a terrible cold right now. I've got strep A of all things, which is a sore throat. But anyway, so my voice is a bit nasal now. And I'm very aware of that because I've done an awful lot of work. So the way that I sound now is not the way I sounded 20 years ago when I first started doing that news reading, and certainly not the way I sounded 30 years ago when I came to the UK, right? So languages evolve, and I think especially for all those of us who are not native English speakers and have other languages going on as well, ours are probably not as fixed as native speakers, for example. So that was a long, long way to go around. I think your actual question was, how did I do it?
How did you do that? Yeah.
Look, I was a journalist and I was working in newsrooms, and in newsrooms, bosses do look around to see who might be a good presenter, and I was producing, and I'd done a lot of radio, and I put my hands up. I'd always wanted to be on air, right? I do a lot of journalism. I write books, I write articles, I do all sorts of things, but I always liked the aspect of going on air. So I very much knocked on my bosses' doors very often saying, why don't you give me a shot? And many had, and it was working, but there would always be complaints. And there were complaints when I worked at BBC London. I've written about it extensively in my newsletter, News with a Foreign Accent. And it's not a woe is me or poor me, but, there were complaints that were specifically about the fact I sounded foreign. We even had them at BBC London. So that's the TV station or the TV program for London, which has got to be one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. There was that. And then they certainly came at Channel 5 as well. I remember one that said, the young ladies, I was a young lady then, the young ladies' talents would be better used elsewhere. And then at the BBC, one email came in and it said, I don't pay my license fee to have my news read by a foreigner. So, there was something, it wasn't just people going, oh, she's crap, I don't want to watch her. It was specifically about this and the fact that my voice denoted that I am of a foreign background, which I am, so I got there because, my subsequent career, I suppose, suggests that I am a good presenter. So that's how I got the opportunity. It didn't work, I think, and I know because they told me as much, the bosses, because the accent at the time, for the audience at the time, was a barrier.
Okay, so things have changed, you think?
Yeah, things have changed. I think two things. Things have changed and I have changed. So I do a lot of work around this because obviously, then I went to work for an international channel where it's slightly different. But actually, I tell you what, anyone who's watching, go and watch your nearest international channel. And I guarantee you that actually a lot of the voices that you're going to hear are still native speakers or sound pretty much can pass as native speakers, right? There may be people that have different heritages, But that voice is a very high threshold that you need to get. So I think the situation changed, as in I think the UK has changed. I think the levels of migration have changed. I think most Brits now probably interact with someone who sounds foreign at least once a day in their daily life. But then the truth is I've changed and I've become a better broadcaster, I'm sure. I mean, I don't think I was terrible, but I wasn't as good as I am now, which is a good thing after 20 years. And I have worked a lot on my clarity. You know, accent is one thing, lack of clarity is another. Accent is part of who you are. Lack of clarity is unforgivable and unacceptable for anyone whose job is to communicate. So I have worked very much on that. I did some voice training at the very start, but really it's like little tricks that I've come up with in time, and just a lot of work around a lot of things. So I think that's what changed in 20 years, the world and me.
Did you have like a coach or a pronunciation coach, an
You know,
accent
that's,
coach?
yeah, you know, of all the questions that I get asked, because obviously, you know, I've sort of been approached, and I don't want to sound proud of this, you know, in a sort of show offy way, but I am touched that a lot of young journalists get in touch with me, who also come from a you know, British or American or Australian, Canadian, you know what I mean, background, because they could see me on TV, right? So of course they would gravitate towards me because I was the only one that sounded a little bit, I mean, in a different way, different accents, but you know, sounded slightly odd. Um, and and so I've done a lot of mentoring. I have an online course now. I still do one-on-ones. And I think that's one of the main questions, like, should I do voice training? So I'll say this. First of all, it's not cheap, right? So you have to think about whether you are in a job where that is necessary, because it could be that the things that you need to sort you out don't necessarily need that kind of voice training. Now, look, I'm a broadcaster, so obviously I think my job, you know, necessitated it. So when I first got voice training, I was so it was when I was still in British broadcasting, and the woman that I was sent to, an amazing woman who I mention in one of my newsletters, because I always say, you know, she was tasked with changing my accent, but she helped me find my voice. And her name was Valerie Savage, and she passed away a few years ago. But she was tasked, so she was told, make Barbara sound either more British or more palatable to a British audience, right? So that was her specific brief. And she did that. And I know how to do that. And within reason, I don't really do that anymore. Now, what I would always say to anyone who's trying to, or who is doing any voice training, is you have to be very clear with a voice trainer as to what it is that you want to achieve. So, for example, a lot of voice trainers will try to make you sound more British, right? Will make you sound more, I don't know. I mean, it used to be called received pronunciation, and that's an old thing, right? They're not going to make you sound like the Queen, but they will try to make you sound more British. Now, in a way, or American, you know, depending where you are. I'm in the UK, so. In a way, I can understand that because, you know, in any language, there is a correct way of pronouncing something and there's an incorrect way of pronouncing something. And if you're going to speak English, you need to learn the correct way of pronouncing things. So there's pronunciation and there's accents. My big thing would always be, it's like, look, number one priority for you is clarity. So focus on the things that you may not even be conscious about, but that make you unclear. So in my case, I had sloppy T's and sloppy L's. So it's when you say I'm getting on the tube, whereas now I say I'm getting on the tube. Ta-cha, ta-cha. Now, obviously, like every man and his dog says I'm getting on the tube, but I think if you're foreign and you already have a baggage of saying things in a slightly different way, that can sometimes be confusing. You can't get away with stuff like that. So you need to be clear. So I focused a lot on my T's and I focused a lot on my L's. And to this day, I never go on air without, you know, doing some mouth exercises or some tongue twisters and stuff like that. So there's, you know, I'd say that. And then I think there's also a reality. And the reality is that apart from very, very, very few cases, if you have learned English past that window of like 15, 16, you're never going to sound British, and you're never going to sound American, and you're never going to sound Canadian or Australian or whatever the heck they're trying to make you sound like. You're going to sound like you speaking English. And so there is a balance to be struck between clarity and speaking English and pronouncing it in a correct way and pretending to be something that you're not, right?
Yeah.
And so that is different for every person. In my case, it was the R. So the Italian R, the letter R, the Italian R is R. The American and British R's are very different. And by British, I mean sort of Southern England, right? RP, kind of mainstream, normal, poshy, kind of posh, but not too posh English. So the American R is pronounced. So in America, in the United States, I'm driving in my car. That's what you'd say, driving in my car, the retroflexive rhotic R. In the UK, or at least in the South, I'm driving in my car. So the R is not pronounced, it sort of dies somewhere, in your lower jaw. As an Italian, I mean, I don't know actually whether it was as an Italian, because actually in Denmark, no, for whatever reason, that was not natural for me. And so I decided that I would keep my R. I'm not going full it. I'm not saying I'm not driving in my car, but, I err more towards that because I found that imposing on myself a Southern English, very flat R, like I'm driving in my car, so not pronouncing it, was very time consuming, drained me of energy, couldn't keep it 2/3 of the time, or certainly half the time, like it would just flip flop. And ultimately, for what? Who was I fooling? What was I, like little Miss Home Counties? I'm not. There's nothing wrong with it, but I'm just not. So that's what I would say. So to your question, should you do elocution? If you think it's worth it, I'm a big fan of training. Nothing ever hurts. But go in with a clear idea that what you need is clarity, and that ultimately, especially in this day and age where it's all about authenticity, you got to sound like yourself and not try to be something that you're not.
And what if you sound like yourself, like
And you still
sound
get
like
fired.
yourself, but you still have an accent that's
That's
not
what I did.
suitable. So okay, so I guess there is a kind of standard, very high standard for news presenters like you. Like there must be some sort of criteria. Like you say, okay, you can sound like yourself, but you still have to have you need to pass like a native, as a native, because you said this as well, I think.
So I mean, it's funny. A lot of the writing that I did, I think a lot has changed in the past year in British TV.
Oh, okay.
From when I wrote those articles. Now, even I am not arrogant enough to think that it's due to my pieces, but I sort of wonder, I obviously have a lot of people, I know, I'm in the media, have been for 25 years. So I've got a lot of contacts within it. And I have noticed that there are more. Now, there's still a difference between international news and domestic news. So look, I don't think people should hold being TV presenters as, it's a very strange job. It's a very particular job. A lot of it depends on where you are presenting and who your audience is, right? So it's difficult to say. When you say criteria, well, the criteria is you make people want to watch your output, right? I mean, that's the criteria. Any boss will not just hire a presenter. You need a safe pair of hands, good journalist, but ultimately someone that engages the audience, that the audience relates to, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of reasons why that may not be met. I think that, again, 20 years ago, yes, it was the accent, but it was about what the accent signified, that I wasn't born here. And so I couldn't understand or have empathy with the issues of the audience at home, and that connection, that trust, that's essential. News is about trust, and trust ultimately is tribal. Who do you trust? You trust your friends, you trust your family, you trust your immediate circle. So the more foreign someone is and more outside of that circle, the less you're going to innately trust them. Now, this sounds like some kind of, vicious xenophobia. It's not. It's just human nature. And anyone who
Yeah.
is arguing against it has never walked a day of their life in the shoes of a foreigner, because it's just basic. It doesn't mean that you dislike foreigners, but God, you'll have known whenever I'm, even outside of the UK, and I'll meet a fellow Brit, I'll relate. If I meet a fellow Italian outside of Italy, I'll relate because I grew up in Denmark. If I meet a Dane anywhere, I'll relate because I know we have that in common. So that, within reason, is human nature. So it could just be that things don't work for a variety of reasons. Just a general life advice that I would give now that I am, approaching a big birthday in a few months. Don't get fixated on one job, right? Don't get fixated on that one thing you can't have. There's a lot of changes in the media industry, especially. So, sometimes it's just not going to work for whatever reason. Try to find out why, and then within reason, move on.
Good advice. Did you suffer from imposter syndrome? I'm asking you this question because when I started teaching English 9 years ago as a non-native English speaker, I felt, especially at the beginning, the first year, I really felt like I was cheating. I thought, who would want to have lessons? Who would want to be taught English by someone whose English is not his first language? So I felt like there are millions of English teachers whose first language is English. Who am I to do this?
Okay.
And so now, okay, things have changed. Of course, you gain experience and you get positive feedback as well from your audience. In my case, the students. But what about you? What about the beginning of your career? Or I don't know, maybe you still feel like this. I don't think so. But
I'd love to know, what was your own answer to your
hmm.
imposter syndrome?
Yeah. Well, I started focusing more on my strengths as a teacher because I had to learn the language. So I knew what my students were going through. And that could, I understood that could be the connection that I could make with them. Like I was like you before. I was in your shoes. So now, yes, you can get a native speaker of English. They have other advantages, but they don't have what I can offer because they
The
learned
empathy.
English. The empathy, yes. But if they are language teachers, they might know some other languages probably, so they might relate. But they didn't make the conscious effort to learn English. Like they learned it as a first language. So like I learned
They never
Italian. I
had
didn't.
to learn how to pronounce the TH
Yeah,
sound,
they never
basically.
felt embarrassed in their lives because they had to speak in English. So this was something that made me think, okay, no, wait a second. This is good. Like I have some advantages over
Yeah.
them. So
So,
yeah, what about you? Like, did you have a
yeah.
similar realization or?
So that's super interesting because I think, there's one thing that you said in your answer, where you said, I will never have either. I think you said something like, I will never have some of their advantages. Because
Mhm.
I'll be honest, it is odd that you think a non-native English speaker teaching English. So I'll give you an example. My son, his dad is English. Obviously, his mom's an Italian speaker, and my son was born in London. Now, I have always made sure that his nannies, he doesn't have many, but like babysitters or people that come over and help out, especially when he was little. Now he's at school, so we don't really need that anymore. Were native Italian speakers. And I wanted native speakers. That's it.
Huh.
And I turned down, because what I want, we're alone in London. So I wanted like a sort of figure It wasn't like a sort of full-on live-in nanny, but I wanted a figure of someone that came regularly, right? And I was intransigent on the native speaker, only native Italian speakers, because what I wanted to teach him was different. He was not learning it. He was 3 years old, 2 years old, even younger, right? So for him, it was all about absorbing the phonetics in the way that you do when you're 2 or 3. You don't need to be taught. You just kind of, you don't really teach children how to speak, in a funny way. They kind of just pick it up. So that would be very different. So it's interesting. I mean, I don't mean that to be against the argument that you made. I totally agree with you when you say that you will have an empathy with your students that a native speaker simply will not have on basic things like pronouncing the TH sound, therefore, thus, knowing how to make that sound that is so bizarre in a lot of other languages, the whole concept of spelling, which is insanity in a lot of other languages, but it exists in English. So in my world, and it took me 20 years and, becoming a better journalist in the meantime, because I don't think any of us should obsess about our language. I mean, if it's an obstacle, fine, but there's everything. There's what we say as well that matters. And so now I have come to the realization or conclusion I always knew. I will never be as fluent in any one language the way that a monolingual presenter is, because the bilingual or trilingual brain just works differently, which is a great advantage, but maybe not an advantage when you're news reading, which is a very particular thing. Because in our minds, certainly in mine, it's not like it's a competition, but I'm always thinking of things in different phrases that apply in different ways and different words that almost mix the languages and sometimes help. In writing, it's great because in writing, I've got time to think about it. But when you are speaking live, and often you have to describe things, and in news, you could be speaking about things that you have no previous knowledge of. Like, I mean, COVID, we all became kind of health experts after 5 minutes that COVID started, and we didn't have the language before. Or, I mean, I didn't, pandemic, epidemic, what's the difference? I don't know, but I found out pretty quickly. And so in news, you'd be talking about stuff like that. And I will never have the fluency, the confidence, the focus of someone who only thinks in one language. Because everything that goes through their mind, they can express because they're only thinking in the language that they're communicating in. My mouth, if you will, is always a barrier. I can't communicate everything that I'm thinking because things that I'm thinking are not just thought in one language. If I'm presenting in English, I may be thinking things mainly like English, obviously, in Italian, sometimes even in Danish, phrases that will and so I always have to provide a barrier. And when I'm looking for that word that, whenever all of us are looking for a word, that word may well come up in another language that isn't the one I'm communicating in. So there will always be a disadvantage. And my voice will always be a little bit odd, and people will always have to tune to it. So what is the advantage? Why do you hire me as a presenter and not someone else? Well, at this point in my career, precisely because of that, precisely because I have a different mindset, because language isn't just language is culture. If you're getting someone who's bilingual, it's not just that I can do some simultaneous translation in Italian. No one gives a damn about that. You hire a translator. I mean, if you want to be a journalist, learning languages isn't necessarily the most useful thing that you can do. But if you're going to talk about diversity, which I talk a lot about in my newsletter, well, linguistic diversity, there's a reason we sound different, because we have a different heritage, different culture that truly shaped the way we think, because it shaped the way we speak. If it's affected the way you speak, it's affected the way you think. If you have someone who comes out with this perfect posh sounding English, it doesn't matter where their heritage is from. Well, it kind of does, but they have also, to a huge extent, been shaped by the culture of that language. It goes for any language, but obviously English ties in with a lot of things. It ties in, with the history of countries like the UK and the US, and also its dominance now, beyond the history, social media, for example. So now I have an edge I suppose, journalistically, and again, it goes back to what you say, because of my background. But I had to get the clarity first. Without that, nothing else matters.
So
Really.
that became your asset. Can we say
Yeah, I kind
that?
of made it my asset as well. Didn't just happen.
Yeah. And I've seen your posts on LinkedIn, and I've read your newsletter as well. And you say something about news that I'd like to know more about. You say that English, it's not international news, but it's English language news.
Yeah.
What is the difference? Because I haven't got. I mean, this to me it's not clear. Of course, international news. English is the language. Is international language. It's the language of the world. We can't broadcast news. We can't present news in Italian for an international audience. So we
Okay.
must use English. But what are the
Okay.
implications?
So give me, and this isn't a test, obviously, and I know you don't come from a journalistic,
No.
I mean, I know that I'm not. So who would you say, just as a consumer, when you think international news, what would you think? So I can tell you what I would think. I would think CNN.
Yeah,
I would think the
BBC, World
BBC.
News.
Yeah. New York Times,
Yeah.
The Guardian, The
So American
Economist.
and yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, The Economist. The Times maybe a little less so. Financial Times. You see what I mean? Or even the news agencies, AP, Associated Press, Reuters. What do they all have in common? No,
So
what do they
native.
all have in common?
Yeah, they're all based in the US, the UK.
They're not just based. They're not just based there. Al
Owned.
Jazeera had a base in London. They are British and American companies. I mean, this isn't like a bad thing, right? I mean, I started my career at the BBC. I've worked for a lot of major international networks, and I think they're great. And actually, I think their standards, look, no one's perfect, but their standards are very high. But you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not like a coincidence, right?
Okay.
Now, yes, some will have, so CNN has CNN domestic for the US and then CNN international. The BBC is going through a bit of a phase, but they certainly have the World Service, which is radio, which is international. And then they used to have the BBC World channel, but it's now merged with the domestic news channel. So that's still a work in progress, but they've kind of merged that. So a lot of them will have like their international channel outlet, whatever. The Guardian has various different editions. But do you see my point? They are British and American companies. And so ultimately, the top tier, the editors, it's not just that they come from that background, it's that their main focus will be that audience. CNN domestic, I mean, I don't mean, look, I'm not a spokesperson for CNN, but it's not even a secret. I mean, everybody would know. CNN cares about its domestic audience. The international channel, for sure, it's great, and they care about their international coverage. But their main focus will be the domestic audience. The BBC is funded by the license fee. They're not there to cater for an international audience. Now, the funding of the World Service is slightly different, and it goes on with the soft power. And yes, there's a lot of nuances. But bottom line is, the BBC is the British Broadcasting Corporation, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
that's, yeah.
Would you say that we cannot, of course, we cannot say this, but my reaction question would be, so can we not trust? Are they biased? Are we only getting exposed to one side of the story? And if so, what news should we consume? Like, I cannot watch Chinese news. I wouldn't understand.
Well, ironically, actually, you can. Because the Chinese have a channel in English. The Iranians have a channel in English. There's several English language channels in Africa, and by Africa, I mean, I think there's one based in Nigeria, maybe one in Kenya, but certainly, like there's more than
Okay.
one in the African continent. Russia has one. Now, there's a reason, right, why certain countries, I mean, interesting, none of the countries I've mentioned are bastions of democracy. But then France has one, France 24 in English. And actually, the one that I worked for many, many years, Al Jazeera English. So at the height of the war on terror, Al Jazeera, that was already a sort of big name in the Arab world and had a very successful Arab language channel based in Doha, but that, sort of covered the world, but mainly the Arab world and Muslim world. When it launches an international channel, obviously, like you say, obviously it's in English, but you have to understand that if you're consuming British and American media, there will always be a lens that you're seeing things through. Journalism is not a science, and this word bias is so negative. Like, call it a lens, call it whatever, because it happens, and I think we need to be aware of that, both in their consumption of media and especially now because with AI,
Mhm.
the language barrier may be broken, but you don't get over the cultural barrier. We could potentially be making the situation worse, not better, with AI. Do you understand? Do you know what I mean by that?
Not really. Like AI, what?
So the BBC could say, well, we don't need everyone to just do in English. We will now, or CNN International will decide, well, you know what, we have the capacity now. We had this one international channel, but actually we can now make sure that anyone who watches CNN International in Italy is watching it in Italian, or anyone who's watching CNN International in whatever country, no, I'm not picking on CNN, nothing to do with CNN, any channel, right? They
Okay.
tend to be but that doesn't mean you would be getting Italian news from CNN. Or rather, not that it's not about Italian news, it's about there always being a lens. You have to be aware of the lens that it's seen through. And I am telling you this after 25 years in a variety of newsrooms. Okay? Because bottom line, any story you need to convince the bosses. And they're not there to be like guardians of the sort of Anglophone world, but they will have their interests and they will have their audiences they're catering for and all of that. So if we're going to get more voices heard, we literally have to have more voices heard. And it's a complicated issue. AI could be helpful, but it will not be helpful if people are not aware of the challenges first. Language is never just language. Language is culture. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And we all know that. All of us bilinguals know that. When we speak, I am a different person when I speak in English. And I'm a different person if I'm speaking to an international English audience, a British English audience, an American English audience. If I'm talking to young people who have their own language, you know what I mean? There's a lot of, back in my day, we used to call it political correctness, but you know what I mean? There's a way of speaking. Things go out of fashion very quickly. Certain issues are very important, let's say, to an American audience, less so to other audiences. So, you're never just speaking a language, you're taking on a culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why when I was in Australia, when I was in London, I wanted to sound like a Londoner. Because that was my way to connect with people from London. Then when I went to Australia, I wanted an Australian accent because I felt odd having another accent, or even the British accent that I had when I was in
Yeah,
the
God,
UK.
no.
Yeah.
You'd be much better off with an Italian accent than a British accent in Australia very often.
And the same the same when I went to New Zealand. It's all about also it's culture, and it's also connection, like making the connection. And some people, I think I'm one of those, are very they're good at mimicking sounds. So that could play, I think, could be one of your strengths. I mean, not one of your strengths. It's something that if you do it naturally, then you will get a better pronunciation. Maybe if you naturally can replicate those sounds. But yeah,
Look, I think within reason, all of us will absorb the sounds that we hear around us. But I would guess, and please don't take this the wrong way, that you never sounded like either a Londoner or Australian.
No,
You
of course
always
not.
sounded like an Italian speaking English in London and Australia. And I would also say there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because that is what you are. And
Yeah.
why pretend not to be that? I think a lot of it ties in with being a foreigner. And, again, that's something that I not learned the hard way, but I mean, I don't remember life not being a foreigner, because I left my home country when I was 9. So that's why the whole accent thing can sometimes be so painful, because it is a constant reminder. Here's one of the cultural words I was talking about earlier. You are othered with every word you say.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? So, pardon the French, but so fucking what? I am not, I am what I am. And as long as I'm clear, and I think the days of people like having this awful bias, I don't know. I think sometimes there are realistic obstacles of comprehension. And then for the rest of it, I think it's often, it's a human desire to want to fit in. And if you have a foreign accent, the second you open your mouth, you don't. And that's painful for a lot of people. And sometimes it's still painful for me. Sometimes.
Every time I talk about pronunciation and accent, I always mention Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like, he's got a German accent after over 60, 50, 60 years in the US, but still he was the governor of California with that accent. And wow, to me, and it didn't work on it. Like, I didn't want to remove his accent completely, because that's what makes him special.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was
And
also, the Terminator voice was,
yeah,
the "I'll be back" can only be said with his accent. If you said "I'll be back"
yeah,
in an American accent, maybe the whole Terminator thing wouldn't work. I think that's a specific case. I also
yeah.
think it doesn't matter how long you are away. Once your accent is set, that's what I mean about that window. You could live in a country for however long. You will always have your native accent, or always. Some people can change, but it's rare. Once your
Yeah.
accent is set in any language, it's the same with learning a foreign language. You start learning a foreign language late. You can speak it well. You can work on your accent. You're probably never going to sound like a native speaker. I think it's about being yourself. I think in his case, sure, he was voted governor of California. Again, California is a very mixed state in itself, with a very, very strong second language, which is Spanish, although I wonder whether in California it's more spoken than English. I wouldn't know, but it's a very close second. And he was a massive film star. Right? So he's not your everyday case. But yeah, ultimately, focus on clarity, but don't, because it's not going to happen anyway.
But sometimes I feel that people, especially in Italy, they want to have a British or American accent, a native English accent, because otherwise they are made fun of. And we make fun of politicians who have an accent, an Italian
I know.
accent, and especially those politicians who try to have a British accent.
See,
And I
to me,
think
that's
you're,
worse. So
yeah,
the ones
exactly.
we make fun of, though, hold on. This is a very Italian thing, but it happens elsewhere. The ones we make fun of are the ones who speak bad English. And because of the words they use, not the accents. So that is lack of clarity and actually lack of everything, because they use incorrect language. I don't think we make fun of the ones that have an accent. If you
No,
think of the ones that
not.
made fun of, they're the ones that can't, so they're making mistakes rather than just sounding Italian. Think about it. I don't want to start mentioning names, because then
No.
we
I
get
don't want
into
to
this
make
whole
names.
political,
No,
what if we mention that party but not that
no,
party, and then blah, blah,
exactly.
blah.
I don't want to make names, but I think, okay, mistakes, but also you can feel when a person, in this case, we're talking about politicians, when they don't sound natural, they are forcing their accent because they want to sound British or international or
But
non-Italian.
that's what I'm saying. That's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because all you
exactly.
do is that you
Yeah.
sound like you're pretending to be
It looks
something that you're
stupid.
not.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
who are you fooling? But also,
Not
but why
us.
are you trying to fool them? What do you really think I'm going to go on air on? I often present on a British channel. Do you think I'm going to go on air and fool anyone that I'm like sort of born and bred in the home counties? Like, why would I do that?
Mm.
Now, trying to make it clear, all of that I've said a million times, of course, right? But but it's hard because it is embarrassing. It
Yeah.
is very often.
You have a newsletter, News in a
I do.
Foreign Accent,
With a
on
foreign accent.
Substack. With a foreign
Yeah,
accent, sorry. I
with a
always
foreign
get it
accent.
wrong. Last time I said,
That's
when
all
we
right.
met, I said news in a foreign language. Okay.
Yeah. No,
But
that would be really difficult.
yeah, totally. Um, and you also have a course that I think was quite popular.
It
What do you
was. I was
do?
very happy.
What do you do in that course? Because you're not an English teacher or a pronunciation teacher, right? And you say
No,
this.
and
You
I'm
say
very
this is
clear
not a
that I'm
language.
not.
Yeah, you say
So
this.
yeah, I say this is not a language course. So it's an online course that I sort of thought of because, and again, forgive me, I don't mean to sound arrogant, but because I have quite a job that is outward facing, as in on TV and in media,
Sure. Yeah.
I would get contacted by a lot of people. And I'm always happy to chat, but you have a finite number of hours in a day, and I've got a little boy, and I've got jobs and book deadlines, and everyone's busy. So I just thought, well, there's a lot of the stuff that I'm saying again and again and again, and the same themes are coming up, and so I decided to create an online course. The information, it's not always open because part of the course is sort of live sessions. So I always have to open and see how many I have. When I've reached my limit, I close the course and then reopen it again. But you find the information at barbaraserra.info, and you can put yourself on the waiting list there, both for the course and for private tutorials, which I do many fewer of, but sometimes when I've got time, I do as well. And basically the basic online course is 8 lessons, and it's a lot of the things that we've talked about. So, the difference between language and accent, where is it that you're falling down? Are you sure it's your accent, or is it your language? Is your actual language good enough? Is your vocabulary big enough? Do you find that you have a sort of security around the way that you speak before you start dealing with accent? When it comes to accents, again, a lot of the things we talked about before, focus on clarity. Don't try to be something that you're not. If you're going to do elocution, be careful what it is you do. And then language and culture. It's not just the pronunciation with which you say things, it's what you're saying, and that comes from your culture. There's a reason you sound the way you do. Then I give advice on media training. So I do like a session that's sort of basic media training. If you had to do an interview, because of course I would be the kind of person who'd be interviewing you, but I tailor it specifically to the issue of second language English, to being a non-native speaker, and things like that. If you need to give a talk, so some of the tips I've picked up along the way. So I always try to shut down the language I'm not using. So if I'm about to speak publicly in Italian, I'll try to shut down my English. So I'll try not to read, write, speak in English for like 20 minutes, half an hour before in town. So you're trying to kind of close down that part of your brain that links the two languages. Same the other way around. So it's that kind of course where, no, I'm not, you have to speak fluent English or the course will be pointless for you. But it's not going to be pointless if you do speak English, because, and that's the final lesson in my course, it's about diversity. It's about getting, your voice is important precisely because it sounds different, right?
Nice. Yeah.
That's why it's important. Because if you
Brilliant.
sound different, it means you think differently. And at a time when we're all rightly talking about diversity and inclusion, I'm sorry, we talk about different voices, and then bizarrely, everyone always sounds the same.
Is so this course who's it for? Like, is it only for journalists or
No, no.
no?
There is one module that's specifically for journalists, but actually anyone would find that. No, it's for anyone who needs to or wants to communicate in English with more clarity and more confidence.
Okay,
Right?
and it's more mindset, would you say, or like you
I mean,
work
I
more
do
and
give
more?
that. Well, I give a lot of practical
Okay.
tips, right? And it's not just mindset. It's not like, ooh, believe in yourself. It's also
Mhm.
understanding the context around everything, because that's crucial. Understand, why are you embarrassed? Who are you speaking to? Is it a disadvantage? And my argument that is that yes, being second language English is a disadvantage. I mean, it's a massive privilege compared to people who don't speak English, but
Mm.
in what we call the international community, or whichever way you want to look at it, it is a setback, a
Mhm.
small one. I mean, depends how well you speak English, but yeah. And so if you think it's holding you back, it probably is,
Mm.
you know,
Great.
because it was me, you know. So
Yeah, yeah.
I
You've
speak
you've
from
walked
experience.
that path, of course. Um, and I had another question. Yeah, I'd like to end with. Okay, I'll put all these links in the show notes, of course, where people can find the course, the newsletter on Substack. And I wanted to end this conversation by asking you a question. What do you feel after all these years? What do you feel that you are still learning
Oh
in terms
God, well,
of
like I mean, just
mm,
as a general life question, that would be everything.
everything?
How to communicate clearly. That
Mm,
ultimately there's a danger in overwhelming people with information. There's
mm,
only so much people can retain, and over the past 20 years, remember that the media landscape has changed enormously. I mean, God, when I was at Channel 5, and when all of this was happening, 2000, between 2003 and 2006 was when I was in, well, actually that's not true, 2000 and 2006 was when I was in British media, the last 3 years in television. um I mean, you didn't really have social media. I mean,
mm,
these are the years before Facebook, let alone everything else. This is before Facebook, right?
mhm.
So obviously now, I mean, it's borderline unrecognizable, but also people are bombarded with information in a way that just wasn't the case, when I was, 20 years ago, it just wasn't. And so even more, you need to make your message succinct. What is at the core of what you're trying to say? That goes for everyone, right?
You
But
mean
so that's
in
the bit that I'm learning
you
in
mean on
communication.
in communication, like it might be written communication, an article, or
Anything.
anything,
What's the
anything.
essence of what you're trying to say?
Hmm. I like this
People just
because
get lost,
yeah,
and
I
then people
like
miss the message.
succinct
Yeah.
writing. Can I?
Which bizarrely
Mm,
English is a very good language for. You
mm.
know, I mean, both of us have Italian as an additional language, or
Yeah,
however
my
you want to
first
say it.
language, I can say.
Yeah, I mean, my first language, I wouldn't say it's not, it hasn't been my dominant language
Mm,
for I don't know how long, but my first language as well. Italian is a beautiful, powerful language, very flowery, which sometimes is a negative word, has a bad
mm.
connotation to it, but, sometimes a bit too much. English tends to be a lot drier, more succinct, more effective sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, it's succinct communication. People just get lost, people get emotional, and like I've seen so many, and even like social media makes it worse because people have a platform. Remember 20 years ago when I started out, people didn't have a platform. You couldn't just go on Instagram and mouth off.
Mm.
But half of the stuff I watch on Instagram, I just think, God, you are actually a terrible communicator. Because I've been watching
Oh,
you, I've given you 30 seconds of my time, and I still have no effing idea what you're going on about. And I'm not giving you another minute of my time because I'm too busy, and there's too many other influences coming my way and bits of information. And that is
who,
something that I'm certainly still learning.
who? Because I wrote something a couple of days ago. I said something like this: the longest, the longest podcast interview that I've ever listened to is 2 hours and nearly 3 hours. The longest book is over 700 pages, and the longest movie is Titanic, almost a 3-hour movie, even more, even longer than that. So my argument was, it's not true that people have a short attention span. It's not true. It's all about how interesting everything is. It's not about, okay, let's make it quick and easy and short and sweet. And it's, if it's
But it depends.
interesting,
Yeah, but something like Titanic is a story, slightly
mhm,
different. You're telling a story, you're developing characters. I'm a journalist, so usually I'm trying to communicate information.
mm,
So there's different ways of communicating depending on what it is that you're communicating. But yeah, I'm not saying, listen, I'm currently writing a book. I'm not saying that
which I
everything
want
is
to know more
I
about as well. But
good, yes. The first version of it is just in Italian, which is a nightmare. Writing in Italian is really hard for me. But God bless my editor who has the patience of a saint. But so I'm not dismissing the longer format, but I'm saying long format is not where a lot of the stuff, like, that on social media is not built for longer formats. YouTube maybe, but even
mhm.
that. So you just need to get to the point, but not even get to the point. Sometimes there are ways in which you don't necessarily have to put like the top sentence, but you need to hook people in and explain this is what it is. It's the clarity of the explanation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree totally. Because I write blog posts, and I get paid for writing blog posts. And I hate when I click on a blog post that says 3 ways to clean the house in the most efficient way, for example. And all you get for the first 3 minutes is an essay on why it's important to clean the house. I already know that. That's why I've clicked on this. So tell me one, two, three.
Tell me why.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and this happens in writing. I've seen this many times. But anyway, um, Barbara, thank you. Thank you
No, it's
for dedicating your time to my listeners, to me, to this show. It's been a real pleasure, a privilege, as I said at the beginning.
no, that's too
It is.
kind.
It is. You're an Italian journalist. I actually wanted to ask you if you think it's possible to have non-native Italian news presenter in Italy, because I haven't seen any.
Yeah, so I do think that English is a different ball game, right?
Mm,
So everything that I talk about when I talk about this issue, I focus on the English language because English is the global language, right? So I'm not sure that a lot of my arguments necessarily then apply to any other country. Italy absolutely did have a non-native presenter. He was on the regional Rai program, like Rai 3 Regionale, for Rome up until not that long ago. I
oh,
don't remember his name, but
oh,
he was he probably still is. He's not on air anymore, but I hope he's still with us. He's black. I don't know what his heritage is. Obviously, I would guess because of the way he spoke very well. Had obviously been in Italy for a very long time. He didn't sound like he was born in Italy. That's what I mean. He
oh.
had a sort of non-native accent, although had obviously been in Italy a very long time. And he presented the sort of regional bit of the news for Rai in the Roman Lazio region. So it's
Okay,
already happened.
okay,
Yeah.
but once
But
only.
yeah, and at the regional level.
Mm,
I think it would depend. It would depend on the person. Yeah, I think there could
mm,
be. But look, Italian would still have to be great. If you're telling me if you could hear that they're foreign born, what would it would depend. And I
mhm,
think if I was the editor of a program, I would build up their careers slowly, which is
mhm.
good anyone for any broadcaster, so that the audience would get used to them. I wouldn't just dump them in at the deep end. So one, it's good for anyone, but because you want people to familiarize themselves with that person. But I think in Italy, the same thing as has happened in the UK has happened, is that those people would probably interact at least once a day with someone with a foreign accent.
Yeah, well, when I was in London, I couldn't find native speakers.
Oh God, no! I mean London. Forget London. I mean London. Like, yeah. I mean, when I say the UK, I mean like tiny little towns in Dorset. I mean, obviously London. Sometimes it's like, is anyone here a native speaker? But even in Italy, you know. So yeah, I think there could be.
Okay. I never know, as a communicator, I never know how to end properly. And I know that in newsrooms you say, okay, thank you so much, bye-bye. You never get them to say, okay, it was a pleasure. Just
No, that's not true. You know why we don't do that?
Oh.
Because often they don't. And then you have the really awkward conversation. So, okay, we'll do it now. Pretend you're the newsreader and say, just say something.
Okay, I'll say something like, thank you so much, Barbara Serra, for being with us today. It's been a great chat, and I'm looking forward to learning more about your projects in the future. Thank you, Barbara. And you say nothing.
That's why we don't keep them on, because 9 times out of 10, that's what ends up happening. And then the other person is like, okay, they're not going to say goodbye to me. I'll just move on to the next story. Okay. So now you know why sometimes, and in fairness, sometimes we do try to get the goodbye, but yeah, now you know.
Now I know why. Okay.
But I'm not going to do that to you, Fabio. I'll be nice and I'll say bye as well.
Okay. Say bye now, please, so we can close this.
No, we got to do the whole thing again.
Okay. So, thank you so much, Barbara, for being on the show. And I've learned quite a lot about news, especially now, like a second ago. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to learning more about your projects, your future projects. Thank you.
Fabio, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have this chat with you. So thanks to you and to the listeners.
All right, we're back. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Make sure you check out Barbara's channels, the Substack newsletter, the course. All the links are in the show notes. And I wanted to end this episode by reading out a couple of paragraphs from my book where I talk about accent. In one chapter, I say this. An American once told me I have a British accent. An Australian colleague says I have a New Zealand accent. A teacher trainer from New Zealand says I have an Australian accent. Some of my Italian students love how I speak English because they say I don't have an Italian accent, while others say they can hear clearly that I'm Italian. I don't care anymore about whether or not I sound like a native speaker of English. And I think you shouldn't worry about it either. In the other episode, in the other chapter, I say the opposite, because this is a book. It's a weird book that I wrote. And I say this: speak like a native. When I used English, I wanted to sound like Fabio, the guy who left Italy in search of adventure, the citizen of the world who could communicate with non-Italian speakers. The language learner who had worked extremely hard to master English and its pronunciation. To me, this was a question of self-image and pride. It was also a matter of personal taste. In London, I loved the British accent, so I wanted to have one myself. I loved the Australian accent in Australia, and the Kiwi one when I was living in New Zealand. That's why I try to imitate the sounds of these varieties of English. Plus, sounding like Londoners, Australians and Kiwis made me feel closer and more connected to them and their culture. It helped me integrate with the local communities. What's wrong with wanting to become a member of a community by modifying your accent? What's wrong with wanting to have a certain accent simply because you like it? Nothing. So don't let teachers define your pronunciation goals. Don't let them decide who you want to be. Shoot for the stars and aim at sounding like a native if that's what you want. Now, it comes from a book that I wrote. The link is in the show notes. But when it comes to pronunciation, accent is identity. and it depends on what identity you would like to have. To me, it was a matter of sounding like, I wanted to sound like a native because I wanted to identify like a native speaker, but I'm not a native speaker. So, to be honest, now looking back, I don't care anymore about how I sound. If someone says, oh, it's clear that you're Italian, well, okay, I'm Italian. If someone says, oh, you sound Australian, well, what's wrong with you? I say, well, I lived in Australia. That's why I sound Australian sometimes. Not I sound Australian, but some people say that I sound Australian. Or I have a hint of an Australian accent. My colleagues at the British Council years ago said that I sounded Kiwi. Then I had a conversation with one of my ex-colleagues from New Zealand. He said, no, you lost your Kiwi accent now. You sound Italian. Okay. Decide who you want to be and stick to that. This is my take on it. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.